Many of you were gracious enough to submit some questions, and so we would like to start with a psychology student, sophomore Bethany Meek, asked a question that really cuts to the heart of this show and is a great place to start. She simply wants to know, how often are people convicted of crimes they did not commit? Panelists?
It's a really hard question to answer with any concrete numbers. Justice Scalia famously, in a dissent, said that the number of wrongfully convicted people was less than 0.5%. More objective studies have indicated that perhaps as high as 3 or maybe even 5% of the people convicted are innocent, at least of the crime that they were charged with. We're all guilty of something, right? But sometimes we are not convicted of that, but we're convicted of something else. And a lot of people that end up in jail are there because the police found something else to convict them of. But the 3% figure comes from a study of rapes in New Jersey over a 10-year period, where every rape felon that was convicted was basically tested on a DNA basis, and they found only 3% were not confirmed. So take that as a number, bracket it, and just consider it.
Dennis, what is about DNA testing recently that's led to, at least in the news, a lot of exonerations, including Stephen Avery of his first conviction?
Well, more recently we have a more sensitive technology that can actually analyze degraded DNA. So it leads to the possibility of actually finding that some samples that might have been, unable to be tested before, now can be tested, and then what you find there is not the person who has actually been convicted. In addition to that, over 150 of the people that have been exonerated through the Innocence Project out of the Cardozo School of Law in New York, they were based on hair evidence. So hair evidence is really not very good. It's actually, the FBI is now doing a study over 12,000 cases where hair was used to do a match to identify somebody as the perpetrator, and it clearly isn't that powerful. So between the increased DNA and the hair, over 300 people from the Innocence Project, have been exonerated.
On Steve Avery's conviction on the rape charge that he spent 18 years in prison, there was both an eyewitness testimony and there was hair evidence. And the hair evidence was wrong.
Right.
And the eyewitness testimony was, of course, mistaken.
We definitely want to get to eyewitness testimony, but real quick on when you say degraded DNA, so does that mean that the traditional methods for processing a crime scene would have collected material even before DNA testing was anything that actually existed, that now they're able to go back and because they have those samples and the physical DNA or the physical evidence?
Well, up until last year, in the state of Ohio, was a 20-year limit of how long you had to keep biological evidence, but now it's been pushed up to 25 years. And the Attorney General of the state of Ohio has a big sexual assault kit project where they're trying to do every sexual assault kit that's sitting around in police stations and lockers that have never been tested. So now more sensitive techniques, more modern techniques are leading to the possibility of finding the right evidence, exonerate people, convict people.
And when did the court start relying on DNA evidence? Because it wasn't available in '85, right?
No, it wasn't available in '85. '86 was the first time that DNA evidence was actually used in England to actually convict somebody of a double homicide rape. So that was the old technology, so to speak, the RFLP, Southern blotting technique, which required an enormous amount of DNA to actually do the test. So now it's a good 1,000 times less DNA is needed.
Oh, wow. Is there pressure on law enforcement to solve crimes in a timely manner, and is that potentially some of the reasons that there are so many convictions that of the people that are innocent?
Well, I mean, I guess there's always a pressure to get things resolved as quickly as possible. I guess the key is you should not allow that pressure to influence the investigation. So, I mean, there's always going to be pressure from the public, from politicians, from your higher-ups to kind of get things resolved. But you kind of have to just put that to the side and learn to deal with it. And I think most seasoned investigators do, because it's constant pressure to get things resolved. So I don't know how heavily that would weigh into the case, but I mean, it's certainly a factor.
Okay. What about just the case volume, simply the number of cases that come through and a public defender system that at least is presented in Making a Murder doesn't seem to always do a very good job?
Well, the irony of Making a Murder is that Steve Avery didn't have a public defender. He had private counsel that was very expensive private counsel. He spent over $400,000 in his defense. The better example of that is the nephew, Daisy,
Sure.
who had a public defender who was getting paid $40 an hour. And it's hard to make ends meet if you're only getting $40 an hour as an attorney. Your overhead chews that up in a hurry. And the pure volume that a public defender faces is a very, very tough hurdle. We have graduates of the law college who are down in Miami, where they basically meet their client 15 minutes before the hearing and don't have a chance really to do any kind of investigation or background, as they're just churned through the system. But that wasn't what was going on in this show. It would be a far more interesting question about the justice system if we looked at how overworked public defenders are and the whole problem that we have in large urban areas of dealing with the criminal justice system. But it wouldn't have made good drama.
What about jury bias? You know, with the media the way it is and has been, not today, I mean, it's been like this for 20 years now, but it seems that the television news cycle runs much quicker than the court system does. Is there any merit to the idea that it's hard to find an impartial jury these days?
You want me to take
Anybody.
All right, I'll take that one. First, as a matter of law, you don't have to have a perfect jury. All right, we don't want the jury that's completely ignorant. If you think about a jury that's completely ignorant, you've got a jury that's illiterate and idiots, right? They're going to be sit there, well, I never read a newspaper, I never watch TV. I'm dumb, all right? What you want is a jury that can be objective.
Yeah.
And a jury that can be objective is pretty much not guaranteed, but it is, the way we do that is through the voir dire system, where we ask various questions of witnesses and we can challenge them for cause. An attorney can get rid of certain jurors and say, oh, Your Honor, I ask that this jury be excused. He's a brother-in-law of one of the police officers. He's going to be excused. I got called for jury duty last year. Now, the idea of me being on a jury as a law professor who taught both the prosecuting attorney and the defense attorney on the case was kind of ludicrous, right? And the judge decided maybe I shouldn't be on the jury. We have methods, and in the end we have what we call preemptory challenges. Judge, how many preempts do you get in Hardin County? 3 preempts. Just at random. You don't like the way a guy looks. You just say, no, I don't have to give a reason. I just don't like the guy. And so we slowly exclude people. Now, the problem in this town is that it was a small town and nobody much liked the Avery family. So it wasn't so much the newspaper coverage, it was more their reputation in the town.
So you mentioned eyewitness testimony earlier, and that's a big area where We clearly see a case in the first trial of this show that eyewitness testimony got it wrong. Dr. ZOLADZ, can you talk about how memories work?
Yeah, I think one of the major things that people forget is that memory formation process is very much constructive. It's not like a tape recorder. What goes in comes out. We form our memories based on what has happened to us in the past, and information that is told to us, maybe even not intentionally, can be incorporated into our memories as our own memories. And when you look at, her name was Penny, correct?
Yes.
Penny suggested that it was Steve Avery who had definitely raped her. It is possible if that the deputy who was interviewing her, when she suggested that sounds like Stephen Avery, that could have actually got incorporated into her memory, and she recalled it as if it were her own. So another thing you have to consider with memory is stress. Stress can enhance, it can impair memory, but one of the things we know is that when someone is traumatized like Penny would have been, you very rarely find someone who's accurately going to recall the details of a situation. They're going to remember the gist, they're going to remember the incident that she got raped, but she's going to have a lot harder time remembering color of hair, color of the eyes, so on and so forth.
Okay. There's a lot of testimony that we see later in the trial, in both cases, where much is made of discrepancies between a statement that someone makes 4 months earlier compared to what they say on the stand. Megan, how common is it for our memories to go bad after a amount of time?
Certainly quite common. I mean, if you look at what's going on with the people in the trial and in the show, we're asking them to recall sometimes minute detail about things that happened a decade before. And I would challenge you guys. One thing that I always ask my students is, you certainly remember what you had for breakfast this morning. Even if you had nothing, you probably remember exactly what you ate. But if I asked you what you ate last Tuesday for breakfast, unless you're eating the same thing every single day, you don't remember it. And so, a lot of the things leading up to Teresa's murder that day, that wasn't any kind of special day for the people who were living their lives. And so they're probably not going to recall a lot of that detail. And I think, when we're watching the show, they'll play a tape for somebody and they're listening to exactly what they said, a few weeks, a few months after, Teresa was murdered. And then 10 years later, they're saying something quite different. And I think that as a viewer, you're like, well, they just said one thing and then completely said something totally different in the moment, and it makes them look very suspicious. But when you're thinking about memory, like Dr. ZOLADZ said, it's not like taking a picture. It's not like taking a movie. Over time, our memories are malleable, and so they're experiencing the news cycle. They're sitting in on trials and, the pre-trial stuff, and so it's all impacting their memory.
Okay. For that initial case, and sorry we're jumping back and forth a little bit, but I think the filmmakers may have played up the fact that Penny Bernstein has gone on to say how sorry she felt, and the case hinged on her eyewitness testimony. But really, there's a few other reasons why the police would have suspected Stephen Avery for that first case that seems to be a little bit maybe overlooked because they had such a strong character witness who then recanted completely. So, you mentioned how Professor Hill, you mentioned how the town didn't like the Averys. But there's reason particularly not to like Stephen Avery, is there not?
Well, Stephen Avery had a history, and understand that this is not in the trial. This is all irrelevant to whether he committed the murder or not. But Avery had been convicted of 3 felonies, so he was a repeat felon. He had once doused a cat with gasoline and thrown it into a bonfire. He had a history of sexual assault-related assaults, domestic relations. He had a very difficult time with women. And this was even before he went into prison for 18 years. So the second question in the show is sometimes, but did prison turn him into a murderer? Well, I don't know. Stephen Avery was pretty much a bad apple before. But the whole family had that reputation. They had a reputation of being clannish and troublemakers. Now, maybe the reputation was unfair. I don't know. But that is the reputation in town. There's a recent book that just came out called Rush to Judgment, in which, ironically, has the same title as a book about the JFK assassination. But Rush to Judgment tries to paint the portrait of the town. Remember, you're talking about a town that's no bigger than Ada. And the Averys were the outsiders, the troublemakers, the kids that were always in trouble in school. If there was a crime, you first looked for the Averys.
So even when they had 22 family alibis explaining that for that assault, that Stephen was nowhere near it, they didn't believe him.
They didn't believe him. They didn't believe them. Unfairly, perhaps, but they didn't believe them.
Okay, Taylor Raybold is a senior psychology student. She asks, is it feasible for an officer or officers in the Manioc County Sheriff's Department to have concocted such a scheme and planted evidence against Stephen Avery? And if so, what do you think their motivation was? So this is kind of the big play by the show, that this is a big, everyone's working together to frame Stephen Avery.
All right. I guess if you look through the whole series, the motivation for this grand conspiracy, if we buy into it, is the lawsuits pending against the county or the individual officers. Professor Hill can talk a little bit about what chance they would have had at winning those lawsuits, probably slim and none. But I mean, I think you have to buy into that they were afraid of being sued individually or as a county, as a police department, whatever it is, and then kind of commit to this conspiracy. I think the thing that kind of worries me is it would be easy for one officer to do, plant some evidence or do anything, maybe even two. But when you kind of start taking a step back, now you have to bring in the neighboring counties and assume that the sheriffs from the neighboring counties are in on this, as is the Attorney General of the state of Wisconsin. And now the FBI is going to come along and use this test just to corroborate, what was shown in the blood evidence that was found in the Jeep, or the RAV4. And I think this is where it kind of gets a little, I don't know, in my mind, a little murky. I mean, do you really think this many people are involved to get a guy that nobody had really heard of? Do you think Stephen Avery was on the state AG's map or these higher-up officials in Wisconsin? Probably not. I mean, certainly the local officers might know who he is, but, in the crime world, I guess he's kind of a small fish when you look at the grand scheme. And to think everybody's all involved in this and everybody's kept quiet and everybody has continued to push this conspiracy for multiple decades now is, a little hard to believe for me.
Okay. Can you explain what noble cause is?
We have noble cause corruption. It's basically the idea that officers may engage in some sort of corruption because they think the ends justify the means. So, what you might find, you take another case, you walk into a room, there's a drug dealer, the drugs are lying on the floor, there's three people in the room. Who do they belong to? I don't know. Nobody knows who they are. They were just in the middle of the room. They've always been there. They don't belong to anybody. So what might an officer do when you write up your report? Say you found it on one of the parties. It could be someone has a history of dealing drugs. You find a drug dealer in the room with two people that you know are drug users. It doesn't take a great leap to figure out whose drugs they probably are. In some instances, officers might be inclined to say, I found them on the person as opposed to on the floor because they think it would give them a better shot give a prosecutor a better shot at a conviction. So if you wanted to go the noble cause kind of corruption route here, some people might say, okay, maybe they thought Avery did it, so maybe you took the bullet and put it in his garage because you thought this will help solidify my case. How often that happens, I don't really know. Did it happen in this case? I don't really know, but that's the concept of noble cause kind of corruption.
Could it also be that they ignore other leads? Could that be part of it as well? Or ignore information they're giving that runs counter to what they want?
Not if we're going noble cause. I mean, because noble cause is you think this guy did it, you think this guy did it, I'm just trying to make sure we get a conviction.
Right.
Where if you're ignoring other leads, that would kind of be, willful blindness to other possibilities. I think that's a whole other creature.
Well, I think there's a specific example where it might apply. When the Manioc City police call and say that they've got somebody that they should take a look at, and it's ignored, and ends up being Gregory Allen, the man who did commit the crime. And then 10 years later...
On the first rape, the rape charge, not the murder.
Yeah, sorry, first rape. And then also 10 years later, the call to, after an apparent confession of Allen in prison, they call, this is the call that comes out during the deposition of Andrew Colburn, and then the suspicious activity is furthered by him writing the first report of this the day that Avery's released.
Yeah.
So there's some compelling television evidence that perhaps ignoring that information might have been as important to keeping him in jail as planting a key later to get him back in jail. I mean, would you say that that's fair to say that it's sort of the same as planting evidence?
No, not really. I mean, at this point, Avery's convicted and he's already in prison. The question kind of becomes, in my mind, what role was Colburn playing? I think he was working in the prison at the time, or in the county jail at this point. Again, this is 10 episodes an hour each. I could be confusing some facts here, but I thought that he said that he'd forwarded the call on to a detective. So if you're just working at the local county jail, it's not your job to follow up on leads to whether someone's wrongfully convicted or not. You forward it on to whoever handled the case. And if he did that, I don't think he did anything wrong. As far as writing the memo or something years later, I think that's kind of a CYA. He's afraid that he's going to get sued or in trouble, so now he's kind of documenting it in case something comes out of it, which it did, I guess. And again, should he have documented the call? Maybe, maybe not. You don't write down every single phone call you received, especially if he's someone in the county jail. He thinks he forwarded it to the appropriate party. I think there'd be a paper trail on whoever the call was forwarded to's end, but maybe not Colburn necessarily.
This is open to the entire panel. Is there any explanation for that sketch artist? Like to have a...
You mean the fact that he was lying?
Sure. I mean, the fact that he kept it as a trophy, like, psychologically speaking, what's wrong with that guy?
I think that shows pride in his work. It doesn't bother me that he kept it as a trophy. The fact that the story seemed kind of inconsistent with other known facts was a little more problematic. The fact that the sketch looked an awful lot like the mugshot.
The previous mugshot.
Yeah, was even more problematic. That's a problem.
I mean, I think it goes back to like the tainting of memory. If he saw that mugshot, I'm certain, I tend to believe people. That might be naive of me, but like if he saw that mugshot and then didn't remember seeing it, that information's still in his brain when he's doing the sketch. Like there's every reason to believe that maybe he was creating what he thought was an actual sketch of the actual perpetrator and then was including information that was from somewhere else. And our brain has a awful way of tricking us into thinking that we're right all the time. Like, that's part of our brain's job, to be like, yep, you're right about that, you're right about that. So even like, when they're like, this is really like bizarre what you're doing here, his brain was like, no, you're right, it's okay. Like, frame it, put it on your wall, show it to your friends.
That's what I would emphasize with not only the sketch artist, but even going back to Penny. When we have an error in our memory, we're still really confident that it's accurate. And like Dr. Kraynok saying, that could have been the case with him, but also with Penny. When she had that misinformation, which was misinformation, she still felt it was perfectly right.
So if we're going to follow up a little bit with Taylor's question about this idea that the police were doing something they shouldn't or behaving in a way that perhaps they shouldn't, I think the biggest example and the clearest example is the fact that during the investigation of Teresa Hallbeck's murder, the Calumet County Sheriff, Jerry Pagel, says that Manioc Sheriff's Department will not be involved in this case at all unless to provide equipment that they may need to conduct searches. We know that they do not abide by that, and they are present pretty much all the time and are actually present when every key piece of evidence is found, at least the evidence they reported on the show. We have a question from Jared Amstutz. He would like to know, why were there no repercussions to the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department for investigating the case, even though they were not allowed on the Avery's premises? And I'll extend that to that they said that they wouldn't be.
Well, the truth of the matter is it was a voluntary agreement. It isn't a matter of that they broke the law by assisting in the investigation. But the other thing that the show never points out is that every time one of the local police officers was involved in the investigation, they were doing it under the supervision of a police officer from the other department. Thus, when the most controversial, to my mind, piece of evidence was found, which was the key, it was found by 2 local police officers, but the police officer that was supervising it was from the adjacent police force, and he was in the room when it was found. So the show makes a big deal about the bias of the 2 local police officers. This had to be planted evidence, but in fact, there were 3 people in the room, and he was doing the search with the other 2. So I just don't think there's anything there. Everything they did was under the supervision of the other police department. You've got to remember, these are small police forces suddenly faced with a huge crime. They don't have the resources. I want you to think about if there's a murder in Ada. All right? Think about it. Judge, how many full-time police officers does Ada have? 5 full-time police officers. All right? That's a little tough to do an investigation. It's not like you see on TV where suddenly there are 30 police officers investigating a crime. It's Ada. It's the same thing in this town. They needed all the manpower they could get. They used whatever they could get.
When you look at the Avery compound there, you're dealing with 40 acres plus of property as well. I mean, imagine you have very limited manpower. Even if you're the adjoining county or whatever that helped out, if you have all your officers on this case all the time, who's policing back in Calumet or whatever the other town was? I agree with Kevin Hill. It's probably just a manpower issue, but when we look at it from the outside now, it seems like there's something going on. They're up to no good, and probably just don't have enough people to do it effectively.
What's best practices, though? If you can do it the way you should do it, how should you do it?
I mean, if you do it, assuming you have unlimited resources and manpower, I wouldn't have gone anywhere near the place, and I would have had other officers do it.
Best practices would have been
yeah.
to get the state in.
Yeah, would have had someone else come and do it.
Yeah.
Did they do that? No. Does it necessarily mean there's something nefarious going on here? I don't think so. I mean, another issue is how many investigations like this do you think they've dealt with? Are they kind of thinking ahead, like, is this something going to come out of this down the road? Do I really need to cover myself here? Or are we just acting on doing the best we can? Ideally, you think they would step back and move away from it, but, that's not what happened. Bring the state in, bring somebody else in would probably be best practice, but, I mean, it's just that, it's best practices.
Clearly appears to be a conflict of interest.
In what regard? Because
There's a pending $36 million lawsuit. Steve
let-
Avery's become a statewide celebrity.
He talks
Let's
about the
talk
lawsuit.
about the lawsuit.
Yeah.
All right. All right, I was a litigator before I became a law professor. And I did some civil rights litigation. Mostly I was on the wrong side, okay? From the point of view of most of you, is that I was on the defense side. But this case is a long shot. You do not simply get a recovery because you went to prison wrongfully. There are 14 states that have statutes that say, oh, we'll give you some money. Usually it's about $100,000 if you are imprisoned wrongfully. All right? To get a recovery in a lawsuit, you don't simply have to prove that you're innocent. You have to prove that the police deliberately, knowing that you were innocent, prosecuted you, or ignored willfully evidence that you were innocent. Now, in this case, they had two pieces of evidence, the rape case we're talking about here. They had an eyewitness testimony, the victim, who was a powerful witness. And they had hair that the lab matched to Stephen Avery. Now, we know that hair evidence is lousy evidence. Now,
Yes.
in 1985, we didn't know that.
Right.
All right? We thought it was good evidence back then. But you've got a strong witness there. Now, I want you to think about that on the stand. If you're a prosecutor and you've got the victim saying, it's Steve Avery, I picked him out of a photo lineup, I picked him out of a live lineup, I'm looking at him in the courtroom, this is the bastard that did it to me. Are you not going to prosecute? They did nothing wrong. Yeah, he was innocent. And that sucks. But as far as liability on the police department, isn't going to happen. Give you an idea, they in the end settled for $400,000. Now, to all of you, $400,000 is a lot of money, all right? You can take care of your student loans. You can go to the Virgin Islands for a vacation. You can buy a Jaguar or whatever car you want, all right? In the legal system, $400,000 isn't a lot of money to settle a case for that's in federal district court, all right? I consulted on a case in federal district court in Cincinnati last year where the attorney's fees, just the attorney's fees, were $700,000. All right? Litigation is expensive. So $400,000 to settle a case is what we call a nuisance settlement. Because we were talking about probably a 3-week trial with attorneys billing $200, $300 an hour. Not the $40 an hour that a public defender bills. It's an expensive matter. So the settlement made sense at $400,000. The lawsuit, bogus.
I was going to follow up, but I'm scared to now. All right. So, Dennis, can you talk about if we're talking about them being overtaxed, if we're not talking about the police force not being nefarious, but just overwhelmed, can that explain why this is for the Hollenbach case, that the burn pit where all the human remains were found, or at least most of them, why that was handled the way it was and not with the state?
Okay, we can do the same comparison again for the Ada Police Department. How much training do you think they have to go in and look for burnt bones? You know, can they recognize that these are human bones? Probably not. I would bet that $400,000 they couldn't do that. Okay, so there's just a dearth of training for them to have. The chief can't send police officers to get trained in everything that they need to be trained in. It's just impossible. No agency can. So therefore, when they have something like this, it's going to be overwhelming to them because they just don't know how to handle it. They do the best that they can, and do they make mistakes? Most probably they will. Well, they just don't know how to handle them because they haven't been trained by a forensic scientist to tell them this is the best way to handle samples, what you do, what you stop at. It's a problem. The training's just not there.
So good training, proper training, could have added a lot of information to this trial, correct? It could, a really good forensic investigator could have determined perhaps if the body had been burned at that one location, taking out all question of it being moved?
I'm not sure that they could have determined that, but the mere fact that you found, bones with the same DNA in it in 3 different places, certainly tells you probably the local dog didn't drag them over there.
Bethany Meek asked another question. She asked, it seemed like there was a lack of evidence that the woman was even in Stephen Avery's trailer or garage. By woman, she means Teresa Hallback. How can they say she was killed there if there's no evidence of her being there? Now, they do talk about, the special prosecutor Ken Kratz talks about there being hundreds and hundreds of pieces of physical evidence that connect. But when it comes down to forensic evidence, when it comes to DNA, the things that would pretty much, well, they would say prove that she was there, it's not there.
Yeah, it was a long time between the time that she was murdered and the time that they did a lot of these investigations and recoveries. You know, even for the bullet that they found in the garage, it was 3, 4, 5 months later.
Yeah.
You know, DNA does degrade, but if there really wasn't a throat slashing, a shooting in the bedroom, then there's not going to be anything there. And it's clear that if there was, unless he was one of the best crime scene cleanup artists, they would have found something, and they didn't.
What would it take to sanitize a crime scene? There is someone featured on the show who's an investigator paid by the defense who says the very same thing you just said, that he doesn't know forensic investigators that could clean up the scene that well.
Right, exactly. It would take redoing the floor, getting rid of the mattress. You know, it's not just painting the blood spatter over, because you can still detect it. So it looks like she wasn't ever violated there, you know.
Okay. But I mean, the prosecution basically surmises that is what happened, that she was killed in the garage. They eventually, I think, say that. They've removed the trailer from part of the equation. But if someone was able to cover up all this evidence that likely would exist, but then parks the car on their property and doesn't do other things, I mean, is that just not much to look into, or is there something there? If you're going to believe that they were capable of cleaning it up to some degree, why make such a tragic error later with something that would be easier?
It's unexplainable.
All right. Sydney Vance is a senior psychology student. She would like to know if there is any innocent explanation for the pinprick hole in the vial that held Stephen Avery's blood. Also, what's the scenario in which, or what's the standard operating procedure for re-examining sealed evidence?
Well, as far as the EDTA tube and the needle mark in it and the drop of blood, that could be just the normal procedure of using a vacutainer, which is a 2-sided needle, to poke somebody's arm, and then it drawn into the vacutainer by a little vacuum pull. So that's normal, okay? And that's the normal way blood is drawn in the EDTA tube, because the amount of vacuum present draws in the right volume. So the dilution of the EDTA, the anticoagulant, with the blood is a proper ratio. So if you were to pop the tube and squirt some in from a syringe or from a butterfly connection, you might not get the right amount, and it might clot.
So it's perfectly logical for that hole to be there.
Yes.
Because it's definitely presented as sort of a smoking gun. It's presented right at the end of an episode, and you're just like, wow.
Right. And whether the
You think he's going to get away.
Yeah.
How many pharmacy students do we have here? Have you done phlebotomy? Have you taken blood? No.
About medical laboratory science.
No. Okay.
Nursing, medical laboratory science. You guys do that, right? Okay.
But it's the standard technique.
Well, it's also kind of interesting that they drop that bomb at the end of the episode, and then we kind of don't hear about it anymore. At one point, I think he says something to the effect of, it didn't play out how we wanted it to, but don't really fill you in on why.
Well, the nurse who took the blood
Yeah.
was ready to testify in the trial
Yeah.
that she took the blood that way, in the standard way. And there would have been a pinprick.
So again, I mean, this is one of the things that raises my concerns throughout the whole documentary is if you're going to give us this piece of information, this smoking gun, shouldn't you also say that maybe this isn't what it appears to be? And if they're aware of that and purposely don't provide you with that piece of information, kind of makes me question the motives of people making the documentary. It's not as exciting if you take out all those, the smoking guns and it's just a criminal case against Steve Avery. I joked in class, you take away all these elements, this is one of these shows we watch on ID channel at 9 o'clock and nobody cares about, right? I mean, it's not very exciting. So, I mean, why would you not present the rest of that information if you're going to put it out there as though it's such a critical piece and then not follow up? It's a little
Because it's
concerning.
compelling. It makes
Yeah.
you watch the next episode. That's exactly why.
Yeah.
I remember that episode. It was like 1 o'clock in the morning, and I was ready to go to bed, and then they found that. I'm like, nope.
One more hour. Yeah.
But even if the hole's supposed to be there, doesn't mean, play devil's advocate, doesn't mean that someone used another syringe and used the same hole to pull out DNA and plant it.
It's true.
So what about the sealed evidence tape being cut?
We know when the sealed evidence tape was cut. It was cut under a court order in the presence of his past defense attorneys when the evidence was reviewed on the rape conviction. It's in the court record.
Also conveniently left out of the documentary, though, right?
Yes, left out, yeah.
And when they resealed it, they just resealed it with Scotch tape. They should have resealed it with a real seal, but
Yeah.
this is a small town.
So they spend a lot of time on the EDTA test. It's supposed to be the test that's going to either seal his fate or get him off. So can you talk a little bit about the history of that test and if there is anything unique or questionable about how it was used in this case?
Well, disodium EDTA, the anticoagulant that's used to draw blood to do CBCs and blood counts, this is a standard procedure. It's not a naturally occurring substance, and the FBI's procedure for doing it using GC and LC mass spec are, good methods. Whether they had a limit of detection that was, as low as they could go, maybe it wasn't. But the procedure and all the identifications of the substance by this, method is, the proper way to do it. The other question you could ask is, if they only tested 3 of those swabs and it was up to the defense, because they have that option of having half the evidence, why didn't they have their expert test it for EDTA? If they really thought that this was going to show that, this was planted evidence, right? So that would be the thing that I would ask. They had their analytical toxicologist go ahead and testify. Why didn't they want to go ahead and do the test themselves? So they could have, and they didn't.
It's interesting you bring that up because it's presented in the show that they just didn't test the other 3 swabs. And so he's asked, the FBI guy who ran the test is asked, can you assume then that all of the blood lacked EDTA? And he says yes. You're left thinking like, well, they only tested half. How can you do that? They have an analytical chemist come up as a defense witness who says, famously, I'm an analytical chemist. I have to test samples. I don't guess that they're there. You're saying that they're not allowed to test all of it at once? They have to leave some for the defense?
The defense is allowed half the evidence. You cannot consume all the evidence doing the test unless you get it stipulated that you can. And usually that they would want, their expert there when it's tested if it's all going to be consumed.
And they make a big deal that this is the only judge who's ever allowed this test to happen in a trial. That it hasn't been done since, I guess, the first time and only time was the O.J. Simpson trial. And and that they were afraid, they asked for it to be done, and they said they wouldn't be able to do it, and then all of a sudden they get it done in a couple weeks, and that's supposed to be suspicious. Not?
I'm surprised it didn't take them longer to do it, but it shouldn't be suspicious. I mean, they have the method in their SOP, Standard Operating Procedure Manual, so it's present. They have it. They can do it.
Okay, we're going to move on to another big part of this show. And Dr. Kraynok, I really want your opinion on this. But first, we want to establish a baseline for what is accepted in interrogations. Senior psychology student Marissa Ramsey wants to know, do you believe that Brendan Dassey was coerced by investigators to, quote, tell them what they wanted to hear, unquote, And what, if any, interrogation protocols are there for a juvenile who has below average IQ? So Professor Kilgallon, you can talk about just interrogations in general.
All right, interrogations in general, I think if we see the video, it seems kind of shocking. We see obviously Brendan Dassey has some mental issues, so he's we're sympathetic towards him from the offset here, right? Obviously the interrogation's go on for an extended period. They tell him a number of different things. What you see in the interrogation is nothing special. There's a whole series on Netflix as well called, I think, Real Interrogations, not surprisingly, where you can see these techniques used over and over again. And everything you do in an interrogation is very purposeful, from the way the room's set up to the positioning, how you sit, how you have the person being interrogated, where you have them sit in a chair. There's usually not much in the room. You kind of like these marathon sessions because it wears you down. This is kind of standard procedure. There's nothing special going on here. And Professor Hill had told me that if you go online, you can find the rest of the interrogation. So once again, they've kind of cut bits and pieces out of this couple-hour interview session and pasted them together to kind of, give you something that's shock and awe. And it's really nothing special. I mean, if you've seen any other interrogations, go watch the show. There's nothing out of the norm going on here. Questions may be raised as to his age, why wasn't somebody present, things like that. I'm sure Professor Hill will address that kind of stuff. But I don't think there's anything truly unique or special about this interrogation at all. You use all kinds of different techniques to get what you want from people. The idea is to break them down and get them to give you information. If you walked in and said, did you do it? And they said no when you turned around and left, nobody would ever get arrested. It just wouldn't happen. And it almost seems that that's what people are expecting here. Like, oh my God, they kept pressing this poor boy. Of course they did. Of course they did. You're allowed to lie to people in interrogations. You're allowed to play the good cop, bad cop. You're allowed to do whatever you want. Not whatever you want, let me rephrase. There are a range of options available to you, and I don't think anything they did in this instance is particularly shocking. The one thing that might stand out a little is I guess towards the end when they kind of push a little bit and feed them the information of who shot her in the head. I imagine it's frustration at that point. I couldn't imagine speaking to Brendan Dassey for multiple hours on end and asking him questions. And I imagine it probably, it wears on him somewhat. And I think he at some point you realize, all right, I'm clearly not going where I want to go with this. So try to get him to say something. And again, I mean, the whole thing is available. It's on tape. Both sides have access to this tape. So if he's going to do something that's underhanded or do something illegal, they'd have access to the tapes. They'd be called out immediately. So, I mean, I guess the main point is there's nothing really astonishing or amazing that goes on in that interview, the interrogation, if you're familiar with this. If you're not, it might shock you a little. And I'd imagine that's what happens in most people's cases. They're not familiar with how these work, and when you see it, you're taken back a bit.
So Dr. Kraynok, I mean, if the techniques aren't unique, is Brendan Dassey's situation unique at all based on what we know about him from the show?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, and so the way that I watch those are, I'm sure, quite different than the way that Tristin watches them because, we look at how our brain develops over the course of adolescence, and this is just for people who don't have developmental disabilities. When you look at somebody who's 15 and 16 years old, their ability to think about long-term consequences of a lot of the things that they're doing is really they can't do it the way that an adult does, right? And they don't think about, how what I'm doing right now is going to impact me much beyond like the very short-term future. And so when you watch that interview with Brendan Dassey, he's thinking, okay, I am being interviewed right now. You have these people who are authority figures, not just to him, but to everybody. And we all feel compelled to go along with authority figures. I regularly ask students in my class to give me a credit card, and they just hand it to me. Because I'm an authority figure, I'm not going to do anything with it. We have trust in our authority figures. And I know that sounds insane, but we do, and that's a good thing.
I have to try that.
Do it. Don't demand, ask.
Just ask.
All you have to do is ask. But, I mean, and that's of college students who are much above, a normal IQ here at ONU, right? And we listen and we obey authority figures. So you have these authority figures saying, Brendan, tell me the truth. It's okay. You can tell me the truth. We just want you to be honest. And he'll say one thing, and it's not what they want to hear. And they're like, no, just tell us the truth. Be honest with us. And so the way that I see it is leading. But beyond that, we look at, how we view juveniles, they, in those situations, aren't thinking about the consequences. They're not able to engage in inhibition the way that an adult would. I mean, honestly, when we look at adolescents and we say, okay, let's say that you committed a crime and the police bring you in. Now, I don't know about you guys, but probably the right thing to do if you committed a crime and the police bring you in is ask for a lawyer. Don't say anything to them, just ask for a lawyer. And people Brendan's age, again, normal IQ adolescents, very regularly will say that they'd admit to the crime in hopes that they could do things like go home. Right? And then you watch that interview with Brendan, and they're like, he's giving them this information, and then he's like, am I gonna get out of here by 1:30 because I have a paper due? You're like, what did he just say? Like, he just said that he did all of these terrible things, and he thinks he's gonna go back to school. And then later on, after he's given them the full account of the story, whether it happened or not, he asks them, they're like, you're gonna be under arrest. He goes, just for the night, right? Like, I get to go home tomorrow. And I think that, when I watched that, I was like, I can't wait to show this in my adolescent class because I talk about this all the time, and I feel like students don't believe me that happens. And so we find that somewhere between 20 and 30% of people of Brendan's age will admit to crimes openly that they did not commit, right? There's research demonstrating this. So that's for kids who have a normal IQ. And then you have Brendan, who is, they keep saying on the borderline. He's a 70, 68, 70 on different IQ scales. So when you're thinking about his ability to understand what's happening, to have authority figures question him and tell him basically what you're saying is incorrect and give me more information, it's no wonder that he is guessing like he does his homework, right? He tells his mom's like, why did you say that? Why did you say that? He goes, I was just guessing, Mom, the way that I do on my homework, right? And so it seems insane. You're like, how would somebody come up with this information? Why would they say these things if it didn't happen? Like, if you know anything about the way that an adolescent brain works, he said it because he wanted to go home. He was scared. He wanted to go back to school. Now, whether he did it or not is irrelevant to those facts about the way that adolescent brains work. I think, this is my personal opinion, regardless of whether Stephen Avery did the things that he is accused of doing, I think the really compelling, sad story in this whole series is Brendan Dassey. Because even if he did every single thing that he said that he did, he shouldn't be in prison. I mean, he doesn't have the cognitive ability really to understand a lot of the consequences of his actions.
You brought up mental competency for trial before we spoke.
The standard for competency is very, very low. It's interesting, we were talking the other day about his IQ, and I was under the impression it was 72. In fact, I checked this afternoon. His IQ was 92. Steve Avery's is 70.
Really?
So he's actually brighter than Steve, which does not appear from the conversations.
Right.
So I don't know what to make of that.
Yeah.
Other than that I don't pay much attention to IQ tests. But
Yeah.
But he, like you say, just obvious from watching the tape, he isn't particularly competent. The big failure in this whole investigation was not anything about Steve Avery, not evidence being planted. It is the fact that his nephew, when he was being interrogated, did not have an attorney or a parent there. His mother walked away and left him in the police custody. Why? I have no idea. Why she didn't call an attorney? She is a woman that had plenty of experience with the law and knew attorneys. But you're right, he should never have spoken. One clarification from the show that the show doesn't show. That's not work. There were in fact 3 interrogations. The show only shows the last one. The first 2 interrogations are consistent and much more straightforward, in which all he admits to doing is helping Avery dispose of the body. In the 3rd interrogation, he gets into the whole thing that he stabbed her too, that he had sex with her, and all of these things that are kind of elaborations. Now, I wonder if that isn't also a phenomena similar to what you're talking about, that he had a simple narrative that just kept on getting more complicated in the third interrogation. Because the first two actually make a lot of sense on how the crime happened. Because in the first two, he says that she was killed in her car and then dragged into the, she was stabbed in the car, then dragged into the garage where she was shot. A very different story than in the third interrogation. All three interrogations are available on YouTube. If you have 5 hours of your life to waste, feel free to watch them.
So when you say that adolescents can't develop or can't think long-term about consequences, does that also mean that they can't create big, elaborate lies that pay off at the end?
So when I say that adolescents can't do this stuff, I'm kind of speaking in shorthand. That's not really true. When we put adolescents in lab settings where they have time to think about the answers to their questions, adolescents with normal intelligence actually do problem solving just as well as any adult. The difference really is adolescents are quite influenced by their environment. So, I mean, you ask an adolescent about like sneaking out of the house and getting drunk with their friends. In a lab setting, they're going to give you quite different answers, not just because there are adults there, but you know, having your friends around, having somebody influence you to do something changes your behavior. And so in the moment, adolescents make bad decisions sometimes. In lab settings, they're much better thinking about the consequences of their actions, right? So when I say that they can't do this stuff, that's shorthand. They can do it in tightly controlled situations. But when you look at, you know, elaborating and saying all of the things that he said in the third interview, and then again when he was talking to the investigator that his attorney had hired, you know, he's drawing pictures, he's saying all of these things. And I don't remember what episode it was, but at some point he talks about he got the information from watching a movie or reading the book, Kiss the Girls. And we know that small children sometimes will weave crazy tales, not just, you know, in everyday life, but when they're being investigated, when there are, you know, officers asking them about different things that maybe happened to them. Like children sometimes will tell adults stories that aren't true. And so certainly an adolescent can do this, regardless of their IQ. Like, yes, it is possible that he's saying all of these things. My guess would be because you have investigators there and you're sitting there for hours and hours and they clearly want more of a story. And so we give them what they want, right? And I would imagine that's what happened with Brendan.
So in a case, is a confession, regardless of the means it was obtained or how it looks, just the fact that a suspect says they did it, how important is that?
Well, you're dealing with two different things. The question of admissibility of a confession turns on a lot of legal aspects. Were they giving the Miranda warnings? How much pressure was brought to bear on them? Did they have, you know, ask for an attorney and not have an attorney provided? These are things that will keep a confession out. But once a confession is made, they're incredibly persuasive to juries. The two things that probably drive psychologists the most crazy about the legal system is that eyewitnesses and confessions both are very persuasive to juries when in real life they don't have a lot of validity because of
Right.
people just try to agree with an authority figure and also they manufacture their memory. But in the courtroom, try to tell a jury that, well, yeah, I know he said he did that, but he didn't really. Of course, the other thing is that the confessions were never used to convict Steve Avery, but they were used to convict Daisy.
Could 18 years in prison have changed Stephen Avery to someone who would be able to commit a violent act? Professor Kilgallon?
Yeah, I'd imagine it probably could. I know there's been studies that have shown that people that have served custodial sentences often come out exhibiting some of the symptoms of PTSD, not dissimilar to people that have served time in war zones, so people that have fought in the military. You have to be hyper-vigilant. You're always concerned about your safety. And if he did 18 years as a sex offender, probably even more so. I mean, we probably all know sex offenders aren't treated too well in prisons. So there's a good chance that Avery himself may have been victimized while he was incarcerated. And just the prison setting obviously changes a person. How it does so psychologically, I'll defer to one of these guys. But I think it would definitely change him. And if you look at somebody like Avery, it seems like he already had a propensity towards violence. I mean, the show starts with him running his cousin off the road and brandishing a weapon because she spread rumors about him. This is a man who poured gasoline on a cat and lit it on fire. So he already has a propensity towards violence. You could argue he's shown a tendency towards violence towards women. Even while he's incarcerated, the whole time he's sending letters to his children telling them that he's going to kill their mother. So if you take that and then put someone like that in prison for 18 years, I'd imagine you could come out a very different person, probably not for the better.
Dr. Zoladz, can you talk a little bit about PTSD? I mean, if it could be exhibited by not simply, but by
Stephen
spending
Avery.
time. Or just the idea that you could develop PTSD from just being incarcerated in the criminal justice system.
From the research I've read, I haven't seen any specific reports of that. But if he was victimized in prison, males tend to report being raped less than females. However, I can see where that would lead to post-traumatic stress. And we do know in psychology from one of the most frequently referenced studies, the Stanford Prisons experiment, that if you're put in a setting that is like a prison, you're going to take on those roles. And so if he was already a bad apple, as Professor Kilgallon said, he probably started to act even more like some of those prisoners in there.
Okay. Because that does seem to be, especially some of the television interviews, some of the coverage, and they're interviewing people, and they're like, this guy got out, and all of a sudden they're creating bills to make, from the Wisconsin government to make sure this doesn't happen again, and then all of a sudden he's a suspect. Some of the things people say is, well, he did spend all that time in prison. So it definitely sounds like, that has merit. Yeah,
I mean, if anybody's ever been into a prison, even for the day to visit, it's not the best place in the world to spend a considerable amount of time. We teach a class on Mondays inside out at Allen Oakwood, and I glad to leave every Monday evening. I couldn't imagine having to stay there for an extended period, especially not if I was convicted of sexual assault. So yeah, it's I imagine it would weigh heavily.
All right. Sydney Vance has a question just about fairness. In our country, they say you're innocent until proven guilty. Did the prosecution effectively make its case beyond a reasonable doubt, or were jury members already too biased? So I assume this is for the Teresa Hallback case. Avery was a celebrity by this point. I mean, he was well known. He was on TV. He was getting his picture taken with the governor. I mean, so then to have, so he already had a certain amount of recognition, and then when the prosecutor, Ken Kratz, gives his press conference, his famous press conference, where he lays out this narrative that is basically generated from Brendan Dassey's confession, all of a sudden you've got a sensational story with a celebrity. So I don't think anyone could dispute that this was a sensational case. And is there an idea that maybe that made it, added to potential jury bias and made it difficult for the prosecution? Or for the defense, I guess?
As I said before, you're not guaranteed a perfect jury. You're guaranteed the best jury we can get you. We don't suddenly say, well, I guess we won't take you to trial because everyone hates you. That's not the way the system works. It can't work that way. Was the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt? Let's see. He called her up, got her to the junkyard. He called her 3 times on a masked telephone number so that his identity wasn't revealed. Her body was found on his property. in the burn pit that they had, that they burned stuff in. The car was found on his lot. I think the circumstantial evidence, if you don't even go to the blood and the DNA, is pretty strong regardless. And that's why the filmmakers had to concoct a conspiracy. Because if you look at the evidence without thinking there's a conspiracy, he killed her. Or, as he actually argued in his own noble way, my brother did it, because he blamed his brother.
Another point, we seem to want to know, is there enough evidence here to convict him beyond a reasonable doubt? And we're not seeing all the evidence. There are 12 people that saw all the evidence, and they reached a legal conclusion. So now we're kind of second-guessing them based on the bits and pieces that have been selectively provided to us by someone who has a substantial interest in portraying Avery as a victim here. I would kind of err on the side of the people that did see all the evidence, saw all the experts testify, reached the correct conclusion, not us based on 10 hours of a documentary that...
The trial was 200 hours long.
Yeah.
The documentary is 10 hours long.
I think they only used 3 hours of the actual.
That's the actual.
of the crime. I think something else that's interesting about this is that just as we don't see all the evidence on the show, we saw things the jury did not. And there's two really, there's two interesting sequences that are in a courtroom and they're with the lawyers and they're talking to the judge, and if you don't pay attention carefully, you think that that's part of the case. And they're real bombshells. One is about the deleted phone voicemails. That coverage is in a motion to the judge to be able to admit that, and they basically say no, but the jury never got to see that. And the other is, one of the most, maybe inspiring parts of the entire show is when they're trying to, Avery's lawyers are trying to get the extra charges based on Stephen Dassey's testimony that they don't end up using removed, so he doesn't have to face them because they're not substantiated at that point. And the district attorney says he's complaining about having to start the case upstream by having some negative view of the state. And Avery's lawyer gets up and he says, with all due respect to the counsel, the state is supposed to start every criminal case swimming upstream. And the strong current against which the state is supposed to be swimming is the presumption of innocence. The presumption of innocence has been eroded, if not eliminated here, by the specter of Brendan Dassey, and that's why the court needs to take further curative action. So that didn't happen in front of the jury, but as for us watching it, that seems like he's absolutely right. So what is it about a court case where, you just can't make your case as well as you would like to because of the rules?
Well, I teach a 13-week course on the federal rules of evidence. You can sit in on it if you like.
I'd love to. After I watch 5 hours.
Evidence, there are rules about what can come in. One of the nightmare of my law students is having to learn hearsay. What comes in and what does not come in, because it's not firsthand testimony. Well, anytime you see the courtroom functioning without the jury present, there is an argument over the admissibility of evidence. Either a proper foundation hasn't been laid, or there's an argument that it's hearsay, and we don't want the jury tainted by hearing evidence that is not going to be admissible. Now, to a certain extent, a trial is sort of a kabuki dance, where there are very formal moments and formal and informal moments. As you try to get evidence in or you keep evidence out, and you do all of that outside of the presence of the jury. I know you've all seen moments in movies and television where the attorney leaps and says, "Objection, Your Honor." And that does happen. But a good attorney makes his motions before trial or makes his motions outside of the hearing of the jury. And that's what's going on there. The attorney was extraordinarily eloquent when he said that. You have to remember, as I mentioned before, Stephen Avery had really good attorneys. They were really good. And now they are making millions off of this show.
So bring that up because the question here is, what are some of the psychological tools that you feel the filmmakers might have used to manipulate viewers of the show? And I think it comes back to just the idea of something that ONU tries to teach all the time, which is critical thinking. We're presented with something very much the way a jury is presented something, with the petitions that immediately sprung up and stuff, and just the amount of attention this has gotten, evidenced by us having a panel. It did strike a chord. It was convincing for a lot of people. But what are things that we need to, just as good viewers, as critical thinkers, as people who won't take everything at face value, like what do we need to do just to not be naive?
I guess I'll speak on behalf of probably a lot of you. When you watch this, you're like, I can't believe our justice system is so screwed up that this would happen to somebody twice, right? Like, you're incensed when you watch this. And I was too. Like, I binge watched it 2 days. I was done and angry. Like, I spent my whole winter break just livid. But, after a while, I was thinking about it. And with any documentary, and I show documentaries in my classes, and I always preface it with, this is an important side of things, but you have to remember, there's always another side to things. And we watch this, and we're getting one side of it, and they do some really genius things in there. Like, they're showing their side of things, that Stephen was wrongfully convicted twice. But they also give you a little bit of the other side. And so when they give you a hint to the other side, it gives you, as the viewer, the idea that they're being fair in how they're presenting stuff, right? And so you feel like you're getting both sides of things. And so it's much more convincing that way, that they're being completely honest, they're being forthcoming. But I think it's always incredibly important to remember with anything that you watch, whether it's a documentary, a docuseries on Netflix, the news, anything, everybody is doing something to let you know their side of things, to convince you that they're right, that they want you to do things. And so, it is important that we engage in critical thinking. It's a skill that hopefully we're all utilizing every single day, but I think that it's really easy when you're binge watching something on your couch to not do that critical thinking. Think about, am I getting all of the information here? Is the information that I'm getting from somebody who has a vested interest? Because always there's somebody with a vested interest.
Including right now with this panel.
Yeah.
I have a certain perspective on this. I think Avery is guilty. I wasn't supposed to say that, was I? Oh, I'm sorry. I also think Brendan Daisy was railroaded. But look at those critically yourselves. Evaluate it yourself.
He's right. I mean, we do have a motivation. On your seats, there's a list of all the of courses that are offered from the ONU course catalog that can teach you about the areas that we're talking about today. So we hope that if you find that this topic's interesting, that you might choose to learn more about it. So our last question: instead of did they do it, what should be the real takeaways from this show and this phenomenon, and how many people are interested in learning about the system this way? And I'll open it up to anyone. Anyone want to go first?
What I think is the show feeds into is the distrust of authority that has become so common in our country, particularly the distrust of the police, often quite justified. But it feeds into a paranoia that just goes throughout society.
Avery's here.
Why are they laughing?
I think something happened outside.
Okay.
A blood-curdling scream. That's what it sounded like.
Was there a blood-curdling scream?
It was indeed.
Or are you just paranoid? And that, I think they pander to that.
Yeah.
They pander to the whole conspiracy notion. If nothing else, the show reminded me of 911 truthers, the people who think the moon landing was faked, the people who think the shooting in Connecticut was faked. They throw a lot of inconsistencies and say, see, it doesn't work. Well, every real story has an inconsistency. That's the way reality works. Reality is messy. But you were very eloquent the other day in summing it up.
Thanks. I don't remember what I said.
You don't remember what you said. She was very eloquent,
It was
trust
good,
me.
it was good.
Take their word for it. It was awesome.
I have 2 points. Following up on what Professor Hill said, many viewers, a lot of people in this room, I guess, would probably find it more plausible that the local police, state police, FBI, random citizens that were involved in the search for the car, and everybody's involved in this conspiracy, as opposed to maybe the guy who lit the cab on fire is really a bad guy. It kind of disturbs me to some extent that we're more inclined to believe in this grand Illuminati-inspired scheme than maybe this guy really did it. And again, I think it speaks to the distrust of police, probably at its all-time height right now since maybe the 60s or something. And, it's not a coincidence that this is released when it is, when anti-police sentiments at an all-time high. So that's kind of concerning. The other thing, I think, is the general lack of knowledge of the criminal justice system. Everybody wants to sit back and criticize it, but really don't even know what it is we're looking at, which is evidenced by the petitions to the president to free this guy, right? They're not even going to the right person here, but they're experts in the system, and they're going to demand justice, and he's been imprisoned by the state of Wisconsin. He's not in a federal facility, right? But they're going towards the president. And it just kind of shows this overall lack of knowledge on our part, which, again, is concerning when you look at TV. There's whole channels that are dedicated to criminal justice shows. You would seem that there's more coverage of the criminal justice system than ever, yet surprisingly, we have a fundamental lack of basic knowledge of how it actually operates, which is concerning.
Dr. DeLuca, what could be done in the scientific realm to help make the system better?
we can get better scientists out there, and you can all take science courses and start to learn more about how science is actually done. The other thing I would offer to you is that maybe some of you would like to volunteer to get arrested, and I can arrange that for you. And then you can see how the system actually works. So any volunteers? Just send them my email address.
I'll represent you.
Okay.
I'll interrogate you.
All right. Well, that concludes the panel discussion. Does anyone have any questions? We do have a microphone we can send around if you would like to ask anything specific.
Pardon me.
Okay. So, are there tests, new technology to test for EDTA in blood? And if there are, if they tested positive for EDTA in the car, what would the implication be?
Well, I don't know if there's any newer tests than what there is that the FBI does. It's not usually a question in most cases, so there's not a lot of labs that would do them. But obviously, this would be a good research project for a student in a science course to see if there is a better way to do it.
The effect would be difficult because he's out of appeals. His only remedy would be a habeas corpus petition or for the governor to pardon him. So basically, he doesn't have a whole lot of options, even if the blood was shown to be tainted.
Can any of you explain the bullet in the garage and explain that kind of evidence? Because there's no other, DNA evidence found in the garage other than that one bullet.
Well, it is found there. There's no doubt about that. And there does seem to be the DNA on there. So what would you like it to explain if it wasn't done the way?
Well, the state convicted him of killing Teresa Holbach in the garage. So if they can say that he killed her in the garage with that bullet, per se, where is the pool of blood that was found in the garage? Where was all the other DNA that would go along with it?
If you remember, one of the other scenarios is that she was actually killed in the car. And, if she was killed in the car and she, was exsanguinated in the car, once she got to the garage, there wouldn't be a chance for much blood, okay? And depends on, when they put her in the garage, where they put her. Maybe they put her in a wheelbarrow and you never checked for the wheelbarrow.
But there's also evidence that he got bleach and that he cleaned the garage with bleach, and that may have gotten rid of a lot. What's the name of the test? The luminol test?
Yeah.
When they sprayed the luminol, they did find traces at a certain point on the garage floor. But luminol will go positive for a lot of things other than blood, a lot of organic material. And one of the things that's really odd about the case, all right, and this is something I can't wrap my head around, they didn't find any deer blood either in the garage, and he regularly slaughtered deer in the garage. So I don't know what's happening there. I mean, I just don't know.
But there's not a certain amount of evidence you have to get to convict somebody, right?
No,
I mean,
you
a bullet
just
will
need
do
a
it.
profile.
Yeah, but one of the problems here, I think, is we've been presented with multiple different scenarios on how this actually happened. And I think most of the Dassey or Avery camp is kind of saying, where's all this evidence? And it depends, it largely depends on you believing that one version of events as told by Brendan Dassey. He's told multiple versions of this. So, one obvious explanation is that's not how it happened. And, maybe he killed her outside, maybe he killed her in the vehicle, maybe it happened somewhere else. So, I mean, if you, I guess, expand and say, well, maybe one of these other theories, like the car theory or whatever, is really what happened, it might explain why we're not seeing the volume of forensic evidence inside the trailer or inside the garage that we're expecting.
The show does not talk about the blood found in her car. Her blood was found in her car. All right? That's sort of ignored.
Yeah,
So-
they hit on it briefly about the hair.
Yeah, we talk
would
about
have
it.
Smeared it or something.
It brings up questions of why would he put her in the car to move her 20 feet to the...
Except for that, unless he killed her there.
I don't know how important the timeline is in the murder, but their timeline was based off two people, correct? Two of the guys that said the sergeant.
Bobby Dassey and I guess was it his uncle, whatever his name was?
Yeah, so going back based on the memory, when he said the flame was 3 feet and then he said it was 10 feet, how significant is that?
I would say, honestly, it could have possibly been, and again, I wasn't there, I don't know what was really happening.
Allegedly.
I think that, that difference seems really large, but I think that still could be, a fault in memory.
And I think there was a big difference in the time there too, right?
There was like 30 minutes.
I think he initially said it was 3 feet, and then when he's, put on the stand, 18 months later or something
It was
says.
a long time.
Yeah.
And then like he said he arrived home at 2:45 initially, and then 4 months later, I believe he said he arrived home around 3:30 or something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, that would also hit on what you talked about. I mean, imagine how many times you pass people on your way in and around Data. None of this is significant until you're asked later, hey, where were you at 3 o'clock? Or, when did this kind of happen? What was the time frame when you passed Dassey heading down this road? I don't remember most of the stuff I do on most days, or what time it was exactly, especially if it's something as insignificant as driving by somebody you drive by
Right.
every day. And now you're going to say, yes, it was 2:47 precisely. I mean,
Yeah.
And then so like to piggyback off that, how important is the timeline there? Like what does the timeline even prove?
the timeline gives you a nice structure, but don't put too much on the timeline being precise. It just, like Tristin says, it's got to be kind of flexible and loose.
But I think they present it to make it look like, if you're unsure about that, what else are you unsure about? Or, do you potentially have another motive why you're not matching your timelines up here? And I think it's easily explainable by, I drove by Bobby Dassey like I do every day. It's not that big of a deal. I didn't record it in my logbook every time I passed Bobby Dassey. They bring on the school bus driver. It says, yes, between 3:30 and 3:40, I'm here every day. Okay, so maybe it was 3:30 instead of 3 o'clock. Killed her a half hour later. I don't think it's a huge difference in the story here.
Had the body not been burned, would they have been able to ascertain more evidence on the timeline based on time of death, maybe?
Maybe if there were some insects available at the time. But, determining the postmortem interval is very difficult,
So is the fact that the remains were burned, the body was burned, that's a big deal in this case, is it not?
Oh, yeah. It's
'Cause it just
got rid of most of the evidence.
Okay.
I was just wondering, for your guys' opinion on whether or not it was correct for the DNA analysis to still be permitted even though she spit on it?
I don't think she spit on it, on purpose, okay? No. But doing DNA in this day and age it requires a little bit of care, and maybe she was just a little careless. But the DNA that she contaminated was the control. It wasn't the actual sample from the crime scene. So, not that makes it any better.
All the way in the back, he's had his hand up for a while.
I just have one. For the campfire, going back to that, would a campfire of 3 feet, or 10 feet, be able to burn a body all the way down to the minimum bones that they found?
Well, the story is that there were a lot of tires burnt to get the heat high enough, to take care of the body. I've burned
Many a body.
I've burned deer in a Sig Epps fire pit from time to time. So they do burn quite well. So.
How relevant do you feel it is that Stephen Avery was convicted of the murder being in the garage, whereas Dassey was in the bedroom itself?
All right, I don't think it's significant at all, because you do a narrative in a trial. A trial is there's never one clear piece of evidence in a trial. There are a lot of bricks. And the real question for the jury was not did he kill her in the garage, did he kill her? All right? And the jury came back saying, yeah, he killed her. Now, the story they told was the garage. Now, with Dassey, it was an easier trial because they had the confession. Okay? And all they had to do was show the confession. But once again, the jury was simply, the question was, did he kill her? All right? Now, I personally don't think Dassey killed her. I don't think he was part of the killing. I think he helped dispose of the body. All right? And so that's one of the reasons why I think all the focus on Avery in the trial is missing the boat. The victim here is the nephew.
Okay, so going off of that, so we talked about, I agree with you about Brendan, so do you think there are any, options now for him at all?
No.
Because I think, no, not at all.
No.
That's the easiest question.
No. There's a certain point where litigation has to stop. There's a certain point where we have to say this is over. Now, After this is over, there are habeas corpus petitions. But what you have to jump over to do habeas corpus petitions is a nightmare. It is so hard. And you have to do it basically with some evidence that is exculpatory, that doesn't simply say, oh, well, this evidence was wrong, but rather, he's innocent, okay? And you got a hard time with that, you know? I feel sorry for the kid because his life is hell right now.
There was a differing with, if you watch the special on the ID channel, along with the Netflix special, they discussed the vial and the pinprick and the Netflix. But on the ID channel, they also discussed how around the side, the stopper, there's blood in there, like somebody had removed the stopper itself. So how would that happen had they not opened it?
That would be interesting. I have not seen that, and I have not heard it. So
I don't know.
Once again, you're going to say because the stopper may have been removed, that the police faked evidence to convict him. I have a hard time, like Tristin does, to think that the police placed the body in the burn pit, brought the car onto the lot, sprinkled blood in various places, put DNA on the bullet. That's a lot of work for the police to do. Why didn't they, as the sheriff said, just shoot him?
Yeah.
I mean, the sheriff, not a nice person either, but that's what he said. We could just shoot him if we were that upset. One of the things to remember, and this, the prosecution has a burden of proving their case, all right? The jury said they did it. The defense, and now the documentary, is trying to poke holes in it. And the blood is one of the holes they're trying to poke. Now, I'm going to poke a hole in the defense's whole theory and the whole theory that the police did this and all the evidence was planted. And that's the junkyard dog. Do we know about the junkyard dog?
Great wrestler.
The Avery family had, not more than 30 feet away from the burn pit, chained a junkyard dog, a mean, nasty dog, all right? And nobody ever reported him barking because police officers were coming in and dumping bodies into the burn pit. The whole conspiracy seems to be pretty far-fetched to me.
Along those same lines, I mean, how many people actually lived on this property?
Yeah.
On the
Yeah.
Avery-Dassey side. I mean, there's multiple homes and trailers, and nobody saw the police coming in and planting any of this evidence at any time. I mean, it seems a little off. You think somebody would see something, right?
Yeah, I'm thinking of writing a book called The Dog That Didn't Bark. Has that been done?
That's excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, obviously there's been a lot of, like, different stories, like Brenda Dassey saying that she was killed in the bedroom and, you know, the state saying that she was killed in the garage. What kind of evidence, like, what would be the real, I guess, the real story, you know, and what kind of evidence backs that up, you know, where she was killed and how the whole kind of process, like, came about with, like, you know, evidence backing that up?
I don't think we have a real story. And I'm sorry, I can't point you to the truth. All right? I think Avery did it. If I were to recreate the crime myself as a prosecuting attorney, I would say that she was killed outside, dragged to the car, and then the car was driven to the garage, and then she was dumped in the car, and he put a bullet in her head, okay, to make sure she was really dead. Do I have any evidence of that? No. I have little pieces of evidence that might lead to that conclusion, but I don't have a lot of evidence that supports it. But I have more evidence than they have that the police and the FBI and the whole town conspired to get Steve Avery.
All these cases come down to the jurors, and I read an article that juries understand less than 50% of their jury instructions. So let's say I allegedly killed my husband. What are my other options besides a jury? Are there any other options?
Well, if you kill your husband, I think you want a jury.
Allegedly, just allegedly.
Yeah, I think that's a situation where you want a jury. All right.
But are there any other options?
Yes, you could try the case to the judge. In criminal cases, we tend not to try cases to judges because in a jury trial, all you have to do is convince 1 out of 12 people to hang the jury, right? Where with the judge, you've only got one shot at one person, and judges, we all know, are deep-seated, cynical people about human nature and believe that everyone is guilty. All right? So you want a jury. The interesting thing about what you said is about juries not understanding jury instructions. That's true. But the one jury instruction they always understand is beyond a reasonable doubt.
Okay. Well, if that's it, I want to thank the panelists again.